right? So at some point you end up on Walking Street in Pattaya, or you take the BTS to Nana in Bangkok, or someone mentions Soi Cowboy and Curiosity wins. And the first thing that hits you isn't the girls, isn't the noise, it's the sheer scale of it. Entire streets, entire plazas, built around one industry, running at full volume every single night. And most people's brain does the same thing. I've seen this in a film, I know what this is. You don't. Because what you're looking at isn't a red light district that happened to form here. It's a purpose-built entertainment economy, decades old, with its own architecture, its own history, and its own very specific reason for existing exactly where it does. That's what today's about, not what happens inside the culture, where this came from, why it's shaped the way it is, why it draws the crowd it draws, and what it actually means for a country that's built a genuine chunk of its tourism income around it. Here's the bit almost nobody mentions. Patpong, the original red light strip in Bangkok, didn't start as a tourist attraction. It started life as a banana plantation owned by a Hainanese Chinese family, the Patpong Panich family, who began developing it commercially in the 1940s. But the transformation into what we'd recognize today happened in the 1960s and 70s, when it became a designated R&R zone for American servicemen during the Vietnam War. Bangkok was one of a handful of official rest and recreation stops for US troops, alongside places like Okinawa. Soldiers arrived with back pay, a week off, and nowhere established to spend either, so bars sprang up fast to catch both. When the war ended in 1975 and the American military presence evaporated almost overnight, you'd think the whole thing would have collapsed. It didn't. Owners simply redirected the exact same infrastructure, the bars, the staff, the layout toward a new customer base. Western backpackers and package tourists discovering Southeast Asia as a cheap, exotic destination through the late 70s and into the 80s, helped along by cheaper international air travel opening the region up in a way it never had been before. Pattaya's story runs almost identically in parallel. It was a quiet fishing village until 1959, when a group of American servicemen stationed at a nearby airbase reportedly rented a house there for a weekend of leave and liked it enough to spread the word. By the mid-60s, the US military had a proper base at nearby Utapao, supporting bombing runs into Vietnam, and Pattaya became the unofficial leave destination for it. Same pattern as Bangkok. Military money builds the scaffolding. Tourism, money keeps the lights on once the military leaves. The difference is Pattaya never had much of a before to return to. Bangkok had a whole city around Patpong. Pattaya was built around the bars from close to the very start, which is why it still feels, structurally, like a town designed for exactly one purpose. Once you know the history, the geography makes sense. Nana Plaza is 3 floors wrapped around an open courtyard, purpose-built in the 80s as a concentrated entertainment complex. Roughly 30 bars packed into about 100 meters, stacked vertically because Bangkok land is expensive, and horizontal sprawl wasn't an option. Soi Cowboy is the opposite bet. One street, maybe 150 meters long, but crammed shoulder to shoulder, betting on density over height. Patpong is the odd one out it grew up around, and now shares its footprint with a night market, so tourists buying fake watches and bar customers are standing on the same pavement, which gives it a strange dual identity none of the other districts have. Pattaya's Walking Street is a different animal entirely. It's not a plaza, it's not a showy, it's an entire road closed to traffic every evening, because Pattaya was essentially built around this industry from the start, rather than having it bolted onto an existing city centre. Bangkok dressed the industry up and tucked it into pockets of the city. Pattaya just let it become the city. And here's a detail that surprises a lot of foreigners. None of these bars can actually be owned outright by a foreigner on paper. Thai law caps foreign ownership of most businesses, including bars, at 49%. Which means every single go-go bar you walk into technically has a majority Thai owner of record, even when everyone on the ground knows who's really running the show behind a nominee structure. It's an open secret across the entire foreign business landscape in Thailand, not just this industry, but it's especially visible here because so many of the most famous bars are publicly associated with a foreign face who, legally, isn't allowed to be the majority owner at all. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because this isn't a fringe industry propped up on the side, it's load-bearing. Thailand's tourism sector regularly accounts for somewhere around a fifth of national GDP when you count indirect spending, and researchers who study the country's sex tourism adjacent economy have put the number of people working in it, directly and indirectly, well into the hundreds of thousands nationwide, though because so much of it sits off the books, nobody agrees on an exact figure. Bars employ dancers, but they also employ managers, security, sound engineers, drink runners, cleaners, and an entire supply chain of breweries, textile suppliers for costumes, and taxi and tuk-tuk drivers who work the districts at night. Then there's the second ring around that the guest houses and short-stay hotels that cluster near every one of these districts, the 24-hour food stalls that only make sense because the districts run till 4 a.m., the tailors and pharmacies that keep late hours specifically because of the foot traffic. Multiply that across Pattaya, Bangkok and Phuket, and you're talking about an economic footprint that reaches well beyond the bars themselves. And the government's relationship with it is famously awkward. Technically, a lot of what happens in these districts sits in a legal grey zone. Prostitution itself has been illegal in Thailand since a 1960 law, but the bar and entertainment side operates under liquor licenses and entertainment venue permits, which is how the whole thing has functioned openly for over 50 years without ever being formally legalized. Periodically, a government minister announces a morality crackdown, bars get raided for a news cycle, tourist visas get scrutinized, and then business resumes within weeks. Because actually closing it down would mean acknowledging out loud just how much tourism revenue and how many jobs are quietly tied to it. There have been serious legislative pushes over the years to decriminalize sex work outright, specifically to bring it under labor law and taxation rather than leaving it in this grey zone. And they keep stalling in Parliament for the same reason nothing ever fully changes here. Nobody in government wants to be the one who officially puts their name on it. This is the part people get wrong the most. Walk into Nana or down Walking Street and scan the room, and it's not a uniform crowd of stag-do lads, though there are plenty of those too, laughing, wide-eyed, filming everything on their phones like they've discovered a new planet. There are retirees who've been coming to the same bar for 15 years and get greeted by name. There are men on their first trip abroad in a decade, grinning like they're 22 again. There are solo travelers who wandered in out of curiosity and are now just people watching with a beer. The demographic spans every age and every reason for being there, and lumping them all into one stereotype misses what's actually a much wider cross-section of the expat and tourist world than the postcard image suggests. And that's part of why the industry has staying power. It's not selling one thing to one type of customer. It's selling spectacle to the curious, nostalgia to the regulars, and company to the lonely, all under the same roof, all at the same time. The nationality mix has shifted a fair amount over the last decade too, which is another thing the outdated stereotype misses. It used to be overwhelmingly British, American, Australian and German. That's still a large chunk of it, but Chinese tour groups became a huge share of Thailand's overall tourism before COVID. And while a lot of that specific crowd sticks to shopping and temples rather than the bar districts, the broader Asian tourist presence in these areas, Korean, Japanese, Malaysian, Singaporean, has grown noticeably. Add in a rising number of Indian and Middle Eastern tourists as those source markets have expanded, and the room you walk into today looks meaningfully different from the one a first-timer would have walked into in, say, 2005. The bars have adapted their staff languages and their marketing accordingly, which is its own quiet indicator of how commercially responsive this industry actually is underneath the chaos. And it's worth saying plainly, this isn't a static industry frozen in the 80s. COVID hit these districts harder than almost any other part of Thailand's economy, because unlike a beach or a temple, a go-go bar has zero function with the lights off and no international arrivals. Nana, Soi Cowboy and Walking Street all went completely dark for the better part of 2 years starting in 2020. Thousands of dancers went home to rural provinces. Plenty of bar owners folded entirely rather than keep paying rent on an empty building. And when the borders reopened in 2022, not everything came back. Patpong is the clearest casualty. It's noticeably smaller and quieter today than it was pre-pandemic, partly because the night market side of it has leaned harder into daytime tourist shopping, and partly because a chunk of its old bar space simply never reopened under the same model. Nana and Soi Cowboy bounced back closer to full strength, largely because Bangkok's broader tourism recovery was faster than Pattaya's, and Pattaya itself has quietly diversified. Walking Street is still the headline act, but the city's been actively courting a different crowd too: family tourism, digital nomads, Russian and Indian arrivals in numbers that didn't used to be significant, which has slowly changed the customer mix even inside districts that look unchanged from the outside. Because underneath the neon, there's a genuinely human dynamic running through all of this that's worth taking seriously instead of laughing off. A lot of Western men who end up spending real time in these districts aren't chasing what the outside assumes they're chasing. They're divorced or widowed or retired with kids who've scattered across the country and don't call much. Life's narrowed down to a routine that doesn't involve a lot of warmth. And Thailand, culturally, is exceptionally good at projecting warmth back at people in restaurants, in markets, in guest houses, not just in bars. The go-go scene is just the most theatrical, most commercialized version of something the country does everywhere, making a visitor feel genuinely welcome. Whether that's a fair exchange or an engineered one is a fully legitimate debate, and reasonable people land on different sides of it. But dismissing every man in that room as a punchline misses what's actually going on for a lot of them, and it would be dishonest to wrap this up without mentioning the other side, because there's real, ongoing criticism of this entire industry that deserves airtime. Groups like Empower Foundation, a Thai organization run by and for sex workers, have argued for years that the criminalized grey zone status of the industry is exactly what makes workers vulnerable, since it means they can't unionize, can't formally dispute unpaid wages, and can't report exploitative bar owners without risking their own arrest. The women working these districts overwhelmingly come from rural Isan in Thailand's northeast, plus significant numbers from Laos and Myanmar, regions where alternative income is genuinely limited, which is a very different picture than the "chose this life for the excitement" framing you sometimes hear from customers. There's also a long-running argument about whether Thailand's tourism brand leans too heavily on this image at the expense of everything else the country has to offer, and whether the government's don't ask, don't tell approach does more harm than either full legalization with proper labor protections or actual enforcement would. Neighboring countries have taken different paths on this. The Philippines, for instance, runs a differently structured but comparable entertainment economy around its own bar districts, with its own separate legal and enforcement headaches. Thailand's version is simply the oldest, largest, and most internationally recognized of the lot, which is exactly why it carries the most scrutiny. None of that gets resolved in a single video, and I'm not going to pretend it does. But if you're walking into Nana or down Walking Street for the first time, you're not just walking into a nightlife strip. You're walking into 50 years of war history, tourism economics, government ambiguity, and a genuinely complicated human story, all lit up in neon and playing music too loud to talk over. So next time someone tells you they're just going for a look, you can tell them what they're actually looking at: a war-era leftover that turned into one of the most economically significant tourism sectors in the country, built on a legal grey area the government's never quite willing to close, staffed and visited by a far wider range of people than the stereotype suggests, and sitting right in the middle of a labour debate nobody's solved. If you've spent time in any of these districts, or you know a piece of the history I didn't cover, drop it in the comments. That's genuinely what this community's built for. And if you've got questions before your own trip, same deal, ask below. Stay safe out there. This is Across Asia. See you in the next one.